Welcome in. Today we're diving into a really heavy situation, a disturbing story out of St. Joseph High School in Georgetown. You sent over some articles about it, and honestly, it's the kind of thing that just makes your stomach drop. But like we always do, let's unpack this carefully and see what we can learn.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's easy to get swept up in the emotions, especially with a story like this.
Yeah.
But taking a measured approach, really looking at the details, that's how we get a clearer understanding of what went wrong and how we can do better.
Exactly. Okay, so the article we're focusing on is from the Big Smith Newswatch, and it centers around a first-year student at St. Joseph's who alleges he was sexually harassed by a group of older boys.
And what's particularly striking here is how this story has unfolded publicly, with the alleged victim's mother, Akila, taking to social media in a very raw, emotional way. She even uses her full name, which tells you something right there. She wants accountability.
Yeah, it's like she felt she had no other choice but to go public,
Right.
She lays out her son's experience, claiming he was cornered in a washroom by these older boys, one of whom tried to force him to unzip his pants while the others blocked the door. I mean, it's terrifying, right?
Look, it's...
And then to make matters worse, she claims a teacher actually laughed off her son's report initially.
If that's true, it's deeply troubling. A child in distress, especially about something as serious as this, deserves to be taken seriously. This initial reaction, or lack thereof, speaks volumes about potential systemic issues within the school. It reminds me of that study that came out last year.
Oh, about how schools often default to protecting their own image.
Exactly. The study found that in many cases of alleged abuse within schools, the institution's first instinct is often to minimize the issue or sweep it under the rug to avoid negative press or potential lawsuits.
Which is just heartbreaking because it puts other kids at risk.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's exactly what Akila is afraid of. She claims the school finally did hold a meeting with the boys and their parents present. But according to her, they showed absolutely no remorse. Some were even laughing.
That detail, if true, points to a disturbing lack of accountability and empathy. It suggests a culture where this kind of behavior might be brushed aside or even considered acceptable.
Which makes you wonder, what kind of message does that send to the students, that this is okay? And it gets worse. Akila says that during this meeting, after one education officer found the accused boys culpable, a more senior officer intervened and suggested all the boys involved, including her son, should just be sent home.
That's quite a turn of events, and it makes you question what motivated that intervention.
Right. Because Akila believes it's because the accused boys' families are big donors to the school.
And that raises serious questions about potential conflicts of interest and whether justice can truly be served when influential figures might be involved. We've certainly seen similar patterns in other cases.
Like that private school scandal a few years back where allegations were ignored because of pressure from wealthy donors.
Precisely. It highlights a systemic issue where financial contributions can sometimes overshadow the well-being and safety of the students.
It's appalling, frankly. And to make matters worse, the article says that all attempts to get an official response from the Ministry of Education were unsuccessful.
A deafening silence, isn't it? When those in power refuse to engage or even acknowledge the issue, it erodes public trust and perpetuates a culture of silence. It's no wonder Akila feels she has to take legal action.
Okay, so we're seeing a potential cover-up, power imbalances, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. But let's take a step back for a moment and consider the bigger picture. You touched on this earlier. How do power dynamics specifically play out in a school environment, especially when we're talking about something as sensitive as sexual harassment?
You're talking about a system where, by design, adults have authority over children. And even among the students themselves, you have the social hierarchy of older versus younger, bigger versus smaller. It creates an inherent vulnerability for those with less power, and that can make them easy targets for harassment and abuse.
And think about the pressure they must feel to fit in, to not make waves, to avoid being labeled a snitch. It's like they're trapped in this system that doesn't necessarily encourage speaking out.
Absolutely. And if they do find the courage to report, like in this case, they need to be met with support and understanding, not skepticism or indifference. Sadly, that doesn't always happen.
Especially if the adults in charge are more concerned with protecting the institution's reputation than they are with protecting the student. I mean, that's what seems to be at the heart of this whole thing.
It's a classic case of institutional self-preservation. Schools, like any organization, can be very image conscious. They want to maintain a certain public perception, and sometimes that means downplaying or even covering up uncomfortable truths.
It's like that old saying, sweep it under the rug.
Mm,
Except in this case, we're not talking about a mess. We're talking about a child's safety and well-being.
exactly. And the impact on the victim can be devastating. It can lead to feelings of isolation, shame, and a complete erosion of trust in authority figures.
And sadly, it can also discourage other victims from coming forward. They see what happened to the first person and they think, what's the point? No one's going to believe me anyway.
It creates a chilling effect that allows these harmful behaviors to continue unchecked. And the cycle just repeats itself.
Which is why Akila's decision to go public is so significant, even if it's born out of desperation. She's shining a light on a dark corner saying, this is happening and we need to talk about it.
She's become an accidental advocate, not just for her son, but for potentially countless other victims who are suffering in silence.
It's both inspiring and heartbreaking at the same time. But it also raises the question, what can we do? As individuals, as a society, how do we make sure these situations are handled differently in the future?
Well, for starters, we need to change the culture of silence. That begins with education. Schools need to implement comprehensive programs that teach students about consent, healthy relationships, and how to recognize and report harassment or abuse.
So it's not just about reacting after something happens, it's about proactively preventing it from happening in the first place.
Exactly. And equally important is creating a climate where victims feel safe coming forward, knowing they'll be believed and supported. That means training teachers and staff to respond to these situations with sensitivity and empathy, not skepticism or indifference.
It sounds like it's about empowering everyone, not just the potential victims, to recognize these situations and feel confident in speaking up.
Precisely. It's about creating a culture of accountability where these behaviors are not tolerated, regardless of who the perpetrator might be. And that includes holding those in positions of power, whether it's a teacher, a principal, or even a wealthy donor, accountable for their actions.
Which brings us back to the lack of response from the Ministry of Education. This is where it feels like the systemic issues really come into play. It's like they're saying, this isn't a big deal, let's just move on. But this isn't just about one school or one incident. This is about the safety and well-being of all students.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the need for greater oversight and accountability within the entire education system. We need clear protocols for handling these types of allegations, independent investigations to ensure impartiality, and consequences for those who fail to protect students.
And let's not forget the police redirecting Akila back to the Ministry of Education. It's like everyone's pointing fingers and no one wants to take responsibility.
That's a common problem, unfortunately. These systems can be incredibly complex and difficult to navigate, especially for someone already going through a traumatic experience. It's like they're being bounced around like a pinball. It highlights the need for a more streamlined and victim-centered approach.
It's overwhelming, to say the least. So for our listener who might be feeling just as overwhelmed and maybe even a little helpless right now, what are some key takeaways they can walk away with? What can we learn from this awful situation?
I think the biggest takeaway here is the importance of believing survivors. Too often, their stories are met with doubt, skepticism, or even outright dismissal. It takes incredible courage to speak out about these experiences, especially when facing potential backlash or disbelief.
It's like that saying, the first step to solving a problem is admitting there is one. We have to acknowledge that these things happen even in places we consider safe, like schools.
Exactly. And acknowledging it means being willing to listen to survivors, to believe them, and to support them in seeking justice. It also means challenging the systems that perpetuate these power imbalances and create a culture where abuse can thrive.
And what about those who witness these situations? What can they do?
That's where bystander intervention comes in. We can't all be heroes, but we can all be allies. If you see something happening, even if it seems small or you're not sure, say something. Report it to a trusted adult, intervene directly if it's safe to do so, or offer support to the victim. Even small actions can make a big difference.
It's like the ripple effect. Even a small act of courage can create waves of change.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in creating a safer and more equitable society, for ourselves and for future generations.
This deep dive was a tough one, but incredibly important. You've given us a lot to think about and hopefully some concrete steps we can take to create positive change. For our listener out there, we hope this conversation empowers you to speak up, to support survivors, and to demand better from the institutions that are meant to protect us all.